Welcome back. The calls are growing louder this afternoon to extradite the founder of that cryptocurrency company, FTX. Correspondent Leonardo Feldman joins us now live with more on that. Hey, Leo.
Hey, John, that's right. Well, the growing calls are coming in after, the Biden administration has yet to extradite Sam Bankman. It is important to point out, though, that reports indicate that the U.S. is actually considering taking such action. Bankman is the owner of FTX, as you mentioned, the crypto exchange that recently filed for bankruptcy. Bankman is also known as SBF, and he's been a mega donor of the Democratic Party. Another key figure now front and center in the FTX scandal is Caroline Ellison, the CEO of Alameda Research, the trading firm Bankman founded. And according to an insider article, her father, Glenn Ellison, is the department head of the economics department at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known as MIT. He once reported directly to Gary Gensler, the current chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Republican Senator Josh Hawley sent a letter to the DOJ, Chairman Gensler, and the CFTC's Chairman Benham, saying, quote, the perpetrators of these criminal acts and their enablers must be investigated and prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and you must conduct a full conflict of interest review to ensure that Mr. Bankman-Fried's status as a top donor to the Democratic Party did not insulate him from oversight and accountability. And calls for accountability are also coming from the left. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren recently tweeted, with each new day, devastating details emerge about the implosion of FTX. The public is owed a complete accounting of the practices that led to this collapse and the misuse of billions in customer funds. Senator Durbin and I are pushing for accountability. And it is important to point out that this case, has some wondering if woke capitalism is just phony virtue signaling. John?
Leonardo Feldman for us live in Miami. Yeah, Leo, we talked about that, and the ESG scores for FTX are actually higher than ExxonMobil, something that will certainly be addressed as well. Let's welcome in our panel to talk more about this. First up, we have Dan O'Donnell from News Talk 1130 in Milwaukee. Also with us, Kay Smythe. She is a writer for the Daily Caller, and Isabel Brown will be joining us here in just a moment. But Dan, I wanted to go to you first on this one. I don't understand all the laws that are associated with international extradition treaties, but there's been a lot of comparisons made here between Sam Bankman-Fried to Bernie Madoff, and Bernie Madoff was arrested the day after his sons confessed to what was going on. So talk to us about why you think this guy has not been extradited and why he's not facing any criminal charges at this point.
Well, the partisan in me says it's because he's the second biggest donor to the Democratic Party in the midterm election cycle. These things do, in fact, take time. I hope that the SEC is conducting a full investigation, as is the FBI. The only difference between this and Bernie Madoff is that this is entirely possibly a far bigger Ponzi scheme than anything Madoff ever dreamed of owning. This is something that potentially has ripple effects throughout the entire cryptocurrency market and the broader market as well. FTX going bankrupt and being revealed to be a massive scam is going to, I think, rightly get people to consider whether or not cryptocurrency is, in fact, the wave of the future as it was sold as. But what's clear is that Bankman-Fried was running a massive fraud, that this was, in fact, a Ponzi scheme. And it is incumbent upon the U.S. government to get him back on U.S. soil as quickly as possible, because we know he has been attempting to flee to non-extraditing countries over the past 2 weeks since this fraud was revealed.
I mean, the political connections here, too, and Isabel Brown is joining us now. We'll go to her in just a moment, but first we'll go to Kay. The political connections here, Kay, too, I think only underscores the fact that the Justice Department, whatever avenue they pursue, they got to make sure everything looks like it's above board.
Absolutely. And I agree with Dan. I think this is going to take a very long time to play out. There were huge political connections to, say, Theranos, and we only saw Elizabeth Holmes get sentenced just, last week? So I think there's going to be a long-term investigation. I don't think we're ever, as the public, going to get the full story here. My hope is that, SBF, he actually does get held accountable. So do others at his company, anyone linked to it. I hope that this doesn't turn into another John McAfee, Jeffrey Epstein situation, because, again, the ripple effects across crypto, that has such a macro effect on how we look at world economics. When you have giant bodies like the World Economic Forum pushing for exclusively digitalized currency, something like this was pretty much the only escape for anyone who didn't want to be part of that giant state-run governmental system. And the more you sort of see stories like this and the trust fade in crypto, the more control that's going to be asserted by these unelected bodies, in my opinion.
I also think, Isabel, you have to look at the efficacy of some of these regulators. I know the crypto markets are not as regulated as some of the other financial parts of the industry, but you have to also think about why this keeps happening. Enron, Bernie Madoff, MF Global, and now FTX. What do federal regulators do, and how come they can't prevent this stuff from happening?
Unintended question there, John. And I think ultimately the question of what regulators really are responsible for even transcends this conversation of cryptocurrency in the finance industry, but really across the board reflects a lack of understanding by the American people, by citizens all over the world with their governments about what regulation is supposed to look like in the 21st century. I think, Kay, you really said it best in understanding that this is very much non-coincidental, a push towards decentralization of your national government and centralization of power at the highest global level. The quiet part is really being said out loud here. And I think, unfortunately, the more people start to have distrust in this push towards the future and towards a utopian next generation future millennium society, ultimately those in power are going to want to hold on to that power even further, even though public trust continues to wane. So I hope that some positive outcomes may come about as a result of this circumstance. Again, the Justice Department does take a very long time to see these things through, but my hope is definitely in a positive future here.
Maybe they could appoint a special counsel for this too, since they're doing that now. But the other thing too here that kind of stinks, Dan, is that Carolyn Ellison, who's the CEO of the Alameda Research, one of the groups affiliated with FTX, apparently she has some family connection to Gary Gensler, who's the guy who's running the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission. Gensler was nominated by Joe Biden. It all seems very incestuous.
Yeah, and this is why the political ties are so big. I mean, was Sam Bankman-Fried essentially buying the Democratic Party's loyalty, knowing full well that he was running a scam operation, and knowing also that if he had the people he wanted in power, he was going to be able to insulate himself from the potential consequences of his crimes? Now, we already have a Biden administration that is facing massive hearings into the dealings of Hunter Biden, which points directly to the potential corruption of the president of the United States while he was serving as vice president. I think the last thing they want right now is this sort of headache as the layers of the onion are peeled back between Bankman-Fried's ties to Democrats and just what he was doing with the money that he was taking in and then funneling to the Democratic Party.
Real quick, we only have about 30 seconds left for each of you, but we'll go to Kay first and then to Isabel. It was a little awkward when you had Maxine Waters, the Democrat who's in charge of the House Banking Committee, calling for an investigation, and apparently she forgot about the pictures and the glad-handing she had done with Sam Bankman-Fried.
But isn't this just so indicative of the Democratic Party? Again, I think Dan just summed it up so perfectly. Like the incestuousness and the corruption that goes completely unmitigated. I mean, we've had people like Nancy Pelosi. I mean, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that her and her husband have gotten tips on stock trading beforehand. This is part of the norm. This is what, unfortunately, a lot of young Americans keep voting for. They think that they're voting for the virtue signal, but really they're just, again, everything that Isabel said in the last part was just absolutely spot on. They're voting towards a future that restricts their rights and their opportunities, and they have no idea. We're the only ones seeing it, and thank you for being the only ones sort of saying it at this point.
Life comes at you fast. We'll send it back to Isabel to wrap us up.
Absolutely. It's never been more important for us to pull back the curtain or peel back the layers of the onion. Like Dan said, we could play this game with crypto and the finance industry, but we could also play it with Congress and big tech, or the FDA and big pharma, or the military industrial complex, and the wheel keeps turning to expose the reality that those in power really don't have your best interest at heart, but want to maintain that power for as long as possible is very much the most important political conversation we can have going into 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, it's such a good point, too, when you factor in big tech as well, Isabel, because when the political campaign contributions are flowing in, it seems like a lot of these elected officials don't take the time to really understand, or maybe they don't want to know at that point what's really going on with some of these groups, as long as they are getting those donations, as we indicated. Great to see you all. We'll have more conversation coming up later with Isabel, Kay, and with Dan. Thanks, guys. We'll see you in a bit.